Before we get into all the cool music theory, first a word from today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Lolol AI. Lolol AI is a cutting-edge neural network that allows you to separate stems within a song. Take for instance the Smash Ultimate theme.
Colors weave into a spire of flame.
Now here is the vocals isolated using Lolol AI.
Colors weave into a spire of flame.
And it's not just vocals. There's a wide variety of different instruments you're able to isolate, such as drums, strings, piano, and even different types of guitars. On top of that, they have recently released a new feature that allows you to remove the reverb from an audio file, which is pretty cool.
Colors weave into a spire of flame.
Just for fun, I've used Lolol AI to separate different instrumental stems from different Smash Bros. Themes, and here's what I came up with.
Colors weave into a spire of flame. Distant sparks call to a past still unnamed.
If you want to separate song stems like this, check out Lolol AI. Link is in the description. One of the objectively coolest game mechanics is an actual instrument you can interact with. Throughout the years, there have been dozens of games with instruments of varying levels of interactivity. The baseline level of interactivity would be something like the Super Mario Bros. 3 Warp Whistle, which just plays a little jingle automatically. But then you have something like The Last of Us 2's guitar, where you can play like 30 different chords, determine the strum pattern in real time, and Ellie's hands even match the exact fingering. And yet, my favorite instruments in games are the ones that actually influence the core gameplay. The most iconic example, of course, is Ocarina of Time's titular ocarina, which we'll look at later, but there are a few other examples in recent years that are also worth discussing, especially as it relates to both music theory and game design. I will, however, keep the discussion strictly about instruments with only in-game influence. Otherwise, the first example would be about the psychic damage of hearing Skullgirl's big band play Among Us at EVO. As far as I'm aware, the very first instance of an instrument in a video game which has individual notes you can play is in Loom, the 1990 adventure game by LucasArts. The core gameplay centers around this magical staff that you have which can play individual notes, which at first is locked to just C, D, and E. These notes essentially function as characters in a password-like spell-casting system. You put together these permutations of 4 notes, and some of them function as spells, opening locked doors or magically filling bottles. As you progress through the game, you unlock more notes in the C major scale, allowing you to cast a wider array of spells. There unfortunately isn't really much to talk about when it comes to the music theory. The staff contains the notes of the familiar C major scale. It would be kind of interesting to see what sort of songs they could come up with these 4-note combinations, but they're often randomly generated, which is disappointing. Still, it is technically the very first instance of a magical, playable instrument in a video game I could find, and fittingly has the most boring example of tones available. But only 7 years later, Ocarina of Time, and by extension Majora's Mask, do something a little bit more interesting with the playable instrument. It's similar to Loom in the sense that you learn these musical passcodes which have magical effects in the world. These effects range from warping to set locations, changing the time of day, or unlocking sealed areas. But probably the coolest thing about the ocarina is the selection of notes available to you. There are 5 playable notes: D, F, A, B, and D an octave higher. I find this so interesting because of how immediately counterintuitive this selection is. The notes, especially with D on the bookends, seem to outline the D Dorian scale. We have D, F, and A, the D minor triad, plus the identifying natural 6th scale degree of Dorian with that B. It seemingly constricts us to a rather limited palette, especially considering Loom's entire C major scale, which seems both more intuitive and literally has more notes to work with. But I think it's this small palette that works so well in the game's favor. First, let's take a look at some of the ocarina songs which are actually in D Dorian. these tunes, D is firmly established as the root, and the melody firmly establishes the D minor triad, as well as the natural six, B, everything needed to sound Dorian. In the case of Serenade of Water and Goron Lullaby, the harmony also supports this, with the very common Dorian chord progression of 1 minor to 4 major. I think this makes a lot of sense in the context of Zelda. Dorian is very idiomatic to this medieval kind of setting, and lends that folksy kind of sound to the ocarina. But there's still a pretty wide range of tonalities across the different ocarina tunes. The most closely related is just D minor, changing Dorian's natural six to a flat six, and sometimes giving us the raised seventh of D harmonic minor. But we still only have that same selection of 5 notes, which means the compositional process for these tunes in D minor has to be subtractive. The B natural can't be included in the melodies. We can see examples of this in Ocarina of Time's Bolero of Fire, for instance. The playable part of the melody doesn't have enough information to tell us if we're in D minor or D Dorian, but the rest of the tune does the heavy lifting. It continues the same sequence a step up, but diatonic a D harmonic minor, giving us a B flat as well as a C sharp a bit later. Another underrated example is the Song of Double Time from Majora's Mask, which in the playable portion is just the Song of Time, but each note is doubled. But whereas a Song of Time in the non-playable part hits the Dorian natural 6, the Song of Double Time gives us the flat 6 and raised 7th of harmonic minor. It's really cool to see this because the playable part is kind of the same as the original Song of Time, but Koji Kondo gave a little harmonic minor spin to the end to kind of distance it from the original, and add more tonal diversity to the soundtrack. So we have D Dorian and D minor available with at least a portion of these notes, but another huge tonality that appears in these ocarina tunes is just major. Most often we get C major, which makes a lot of sense of course, as D Dorian has all of the same notes as C major. Take for instance Saria's song, or the Lost Woods theme. One thing I think is really cool about these C major tunes is how they're composed despite lacking the most important part of establishing C major, the C major triad. Our C major chord contains C, E, and G, none of which are available given our 5 ocarina notes. Koji Kondo's workaround was simply having all of the C major tunes not start on the C major chord, instead starting on our 4 F major, of which F and A are chord tones, and then eventually resolving to our key of C major after the playable section is over. It's just so dang clever, and a great example of how important harmonic context is in establishing a key center. These simple melodies, which are often just 3 notes which repeat, seemingly establish a strong key center on the very first chord. The playable part of Saria's song, for instance, has the identifying notes of the F Lydian scale, with F and A outlining our major triad, and the B giving us the bright sharp 11. But upon hearing the rest of the tune, it becomes clear that this F Lydian kind of sound is actually just our Lydian-flavored 4 chord, which is just diatonic to C major. There are a few other tonalities across the rest of the ocarina tunes, such as D major in Epona's song or G major in Zelda's Lullaby, both of which cleverly have to avoid the notes in our selection that would clash with their respective tonalities. There is also one insane example of E Dorian, which appears in the Minuet of Forest. This one just feels so counterintuitive to me, because while these notes could indeed be diatonic to E Dorian, this melody could have just worked perfectly over the exact same chord progression in D Dorian down a whole step, of which we've seen a few other times. But the slightly more unexpected E Dorian just serves to add even more tonal diversity to our ocarina songs, and I think that's just pretty cool. But anyways, I think all of this clearly answers why we have this bizarre selection of 5 notes. It's the ambiguity of the missing scale tones that allows for such diversity. The striking interval of our F and B appears in so many of our melodies, which, outside of the context of the rest of the tune, makes it so idiosyncratic and memorable. And with the rest of the context of the orchestra that kicks in after the playable section, it recontextualizes your 5 to 7 note jingle into an actual song, typically in a different key center from the previous song that you played. If we just had, say, all of the notes of C major, not only would it be too many notes to memorize, but I feel like it would be easy for everything to eventually blend together into C major land, and the strikingness of these stilted, simple melodies would be lost. It's really clever from a game design perspective. It consolidates multiple unrelated magic spells into a single item, but still feels cohesive because the effects are tied to actual songs you learn organically throughout the game. And as mentioned previously, all of these tunes are so memorable. The melodies are kind of weird, but not only do you end up playing some of them so often, half of the time the melody is just the same 3 notes played twice. And repetition legitimizes, or something. It's also really cool because a lot of the music has this interesting semi-diegesis, or existence in universe. You hear the Lost Woods theme pretty early on as just background music, but then later Saria actually teaches it to you, at which point you're probably already familiar enough with it that you can just play it by ear. Not only are the ocarina tunes often folk music in-game, passed down through oral tradition, but you, the player in real life, are also learning the music in the exact same way, often by hearing it first and then playing it later after it's already familiar. Sure, they allow you to read these button inputs of the songs if you ever forget, but through a triumph of game design and composition, you never really need to. As usually, if you ever forget, you can just brain blast any of these catchy little tunes, assuming that you're not just in the area where the tune is playing to begin with. It's something I wish remained a mainstay in the Zelda series. Sure, we had kind of bare-bones versions in Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Spirit Tracks, but we haven't really seen this system of playable notes since Majora's Mask. I think it would be kind of cool if in Breath of the Wild or Tears, rather than just clicking on random shrines to warp, you have to make Link hit a blinker on the Sheikah Slate's Ocarina app for a one-way ticket on the Ubisoft Tower Express. Okay, but anyways, recently I found a game that uses a pretty similar system to Ocarina of Time, an indie game called Phoenotopia Awakening. A bit of a ways in, you get a flute, which also has 5 different notes: E, F, A, B flat, and C. The similarities are immediately apparent from the amount of notes, usage in unlocking sealed areas, or interacting with NPCs, plus the little fanfare that plays after the playable section. But there are some interesting differences as well. Let's take a look at those notes again. It's not quite as clear as Ocarina of Time's Dorian outline, and the range is only a 1/6, compared to Ocarina of Time's octave. I suppose with E in the bottom and with F and B flat, everything is kind of diatonic to E Locrian, I suppose. But it's really just a permutation of F major and functions as such in the different flute songs that you learn. Let's take a look at a few of the examples, starting with the prelude of Pancello. We can see how it leans into the F major triad, except with some B flats as passing tones. In fact, almost all of the playable flute songs also stick to an F major-ish kind of sound, presumably because of the strength of the F, A, and C in our playable notes. There is an interesting example of a relative minor of F, D minor, in one of the tunes, which resolves to D major at the end in a kind of Ocarina of Time Picardy third type thing. Much like Ocarina of Time, I don't know for certain if the 5 notes were determined before writing the music, but it certainly does seem that way. This game is a remaster of sorts of an earlier Flash game version, and both the flute and the flute songs are original to this newer version. What's cool is that the Pancello song from earlier actually did exist in the original, but the playable part we hear in the flute song was actually composed as a B section for the remaster. It's a pretty unique compositional process if anything, and it's cool to see the difference between Ocarina of Time's more ambiguous note selections versus Phoenotopia's less ambiguous F major. And then we have something completely different with Animal Well. Just a warning, there will be some mild early game spoilers, but I'll try to keep it as vague as possible. But anyways, Animal Well, much like Phoenotopia, bestows you with a little flute at some point in the game. But unlike our previous 2 games, the note inputs are 8 directional, and the notes are just the A major scale with an A on top as well. It's almost more similar to Loom in this regard. There's similarly no orchestral fanfare after you successfully play a tune, the effect just happens. I think the coolest thing about Animal Well's flute is simply how basic and straightforward the understanding of the flute and its directions is. You start on the low A by pressing right, and as you spin clockwise, it just climbs up the notes of the A major scale. From a game design perspective, it's cool because it allows for a wider range of notes in these musical passwords, but actually eliminates the guesswork in pitch assignment for each direction. Since there's no gaps, at any point you can just think about it and hit the pitch you want by just counting. The playable songs throughout the game often utilize the A major 7 arpeggio, and it's uniquely intuitive to play it with just the 4 cardinal directions moving clockwise. It's actually pretty cool because this same arpeggio is used in the sound design of the menu navigation, though frustratingly rotated clockwise by 90 degrees. I'll forgive the oversight though, because knowing Big Mode, it's probably some obscure hint of an ARG that will unlock a video game donkey Easter egg at some point in the future.
King Leonidas?
But anyways, I think this A major tonality is used so effectively here. It's the anti-Ocarina of Time. The cheerful and unambiguously familiar A major scale almost forms this ironic contrast with the environment, feeling so human amongst these uncanny animals. It tonally pierces right through this sparse background music, which even when it is occasionally present, is never in this overtly major kind of tonality. Because of how rare the A major and just tonality in general is in the game, there are times when you're being taught a new flute song and the only way you realize is that it's vaguely tonal and in the same key as your flute, and then you can piece together visual elements to solve the puzzle. I'll still keep this vague of course, but if you've played the game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's really cool because it's still kind of that same diegetic oral folk song approach as the other games. They're still not just depositing sheet music into your inventory. All of these songs are available for you to play at any time, but you have to go around and find where these songs exist in the world, or often figure out you're perceiving a song in the first place. And this, on top of the intuitive directional assignments to the notes of the A major scale, makes memorizing the tunes easier than you would expect, even with more possible input directions and typically longer songs than the other games. You're usually not memorizing pure directional inputs like some sick freak. Often you're aided by the kind tonality of A major. At least during my playthrough, I barely had to write anything down, and even the longer flute songs I could kind of just think really hard and then commit it to memory by just remembering the feeling of the song. And that's just a great way to make a password system. I wish there were more games that featured something like this. I'm sure I've missed some huge examples in my research, so if you guys know of any, post them in the comments so I can play them. My hot take is that this kind of system can and should exist in every game. I should be able to take out a stylophone in GTA 5 that plays a little jingle that summons Lamar. These kinds of playable instruments are just a testament to the human spirit and pursuit of soulfulness and whimsy. I didn't really mention it, but Ocarina of Time, Phoenotopia, and Animal Well all have secret inputs which allow you to chromatically alter the notes or change the octave, giving you even more notes to play around with despite it not having any actual in-game effect. And if that's not cool game design, I don't know what is. Or maybe these notes are a secret so you can't play Among Us.